Late night at a New York subway station. The lights are flickering, cold and fluorescent. The hollow roar of trains echoes through the concrete tunnels. Daniel Brooks, a 41-year-old single father, stands on the platform with his 9-year-old daughter, Emma. In the corner, a woman in a full military uniform sits against the wall. Her eyes are empty, staring at a world no one else can see. People rush past, but no one stops. Emma pulls his hand. "Dad, is she okay?" Daniel looks. He knows that stare. The train arrives, but Daniel stays. He walks to her. "Come with us. Now. Watch." Daniel Brooks was a man of steel and silence. At 41, his face was a map of quiet resilience, etched with the subtle lines of a man who worked with his hands to keep a small home safe. He was a senior technician for the city's power grid, responsible for the invisible currents that kept the city's heart beating. But his true life began the moment he clocked out, shed his heavy work boots, and became dad. Daniel was a single father to Emma, and their world was a rhythmic, predictable sanctuary against the chaotic, unforgiving noise of New York City. But Daniel had a history he rarely spoke of, a vault of memories locked away for the sake of his daughter. 12 years ago, he had served a short stint in the Army. He wasn't a combat hero or a decorated special operative. He was a logistical specialist who worked in the medical and support units. During his service, he had spent countless hours in the back of transport planes and in field hospitals, sitting alongside men and women returning from the front lines. He had seen the way a human being can look physically whole, but be shattered internally. He had seen the 1,000-yard stare, the way the eyes stop reflecting the world and start reflecting a dark, private memory of fire and dust. The woman at the subway station was the textbook definition of a ghost. She was dressed in OCP camouflage, her boots scuffed with a fine yellow dust that didn't look like New York grime. She wasn't shaking. She wasn't crying. She was simply gone. To the other commuters, she was just another homeless veteran or a soldier who had one too many drinks. They saw the uniform and felt a flicker of uncomfortable guilt, so they looked at their phones, adjusted their expensive headphones, and walked faster. In New York, the unofficial rule is, if it looks broken, don't touch it. Daniel observed her from 10 feet away, ignoring the "stand clear of the closing doors" announcement. He noticed her hands. They were clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles were bone white. She was breathing, but it was shallow, almost forced, as if her lungs were still adjusting to air that didn't smell like cordite. She was experiencing a disconnection, a state of PTSD where the present reality becomes an enemy, and the mind retreats into a bunker of absolute silence. Daniel felt a sharp, familiar pang in his chest. He remembered a sergeant he had worked with in Germany who used to sit exactly like that in the cafeteria, staring at a cup of cold coffee for 3 hours. One day, that sergeant didn't show up for duty. Daniel had promised himself then that if he ever saw that look again, he wouldn't just be a witness. He wouldn't let the train doors close on a soul trapped in transit. He knew that the most dangerous place in the world for a soldier wasn't the battlefield. It was the walk home alone. Emma was the first one to truly break the spell. "Dad, she looks like the statue in the park," the little girl whispered, her hazel eyes filled with a pure, unclouded empathy that only a child can possess. "She's not moving her eyes. Is she stuck?" Daniel squeezed Emma's hand. He saw the train pulling into the station, the wind rushing ahead of it like a cold sigh. He saw the commuters crowding the doors, ready to vanish into their own warm apartments and dinner plans. He looked at the soldier one last time. He realized she wasn't waiting for a train. She was waiting for the end of a world she no longer recognized. She was standing at the edge of an abyss, and everyone was too busy to notice the fall. "We're not taking this one, pal," Daniel said softly. He didn't need to explain his logic to a 9-year-old. Children understand the frequency of sadness better than any adult. Daniel walked across the yellow line, his heavy work boots sounding solid and grounding on the concrete. He didn't approach her aggressively or shout for a medic. He stopped a few feet away, lowering his energy, making himself as small and non-threatening as a man his size could. He didn't ask for her ID. He didn't ask what happened in the desert. He simply spoke into the silence with a voice that was as steady as a heartbeat, a frequency meant to cut through the static of a panic attack. "Come with us." The soldier didn't move for 5 long seconds. Then slowly, painfully, her head tilted up. Her eyes found Daniel's, and for a fraction of a second, the emptiness flickered. She saw a father. She saw a little girl. She saw a hand reaching through the smoke. She saw a way out of the tunnel. The walk out of the subway was the quietest mile Daniel had ever traveled. The soldier, whose name Daniel would later learn was Clara Hayes, didn't ask where they were going. She didn't ask if he was a predator or a saint. She simply followed the rhythm of his footsteps, her body moving with a mechanical stiffness, like a machine that was running on its very last reserve of battery. Emma walked on the other side of Clara, her small fingers occasionally brushing the sleeve of the soldier's rugged jacket. "It's not far," Emma whispered, looking up with a shy, gap-toothed smile. "We have cocoa at home, and Dad makes the best grilled cheese with the crunchy edges." Clara flinched slightly at the word home. It was a word that felt like a foreign language, a sound from a life she had lived 1,000 years ago. As they emerged from the underground, the night air of New York hit them, sharp, cold, and smelling of wet asphalt. The city was a kaleidoscope of sirens, neon advertisements, and the aggressive honking of taxis. For a civilian, it was just Tuesday. For Clara, it was a sensory overload. Daniel noticed the way she scanned the rooftops and the alleyways. He recognized the tactical hypervigilance, the exhausting 24/7 awareness of someone who has spent too much time in a place where every shadow is a threat and every loud noise is a potential mortar strike. He didn't take her to a hospital. He didn't take her to a police station. Daniel knew that the last thing Clara needed was a sterile room filled with people asking her to fill out forms and describe her trauma in 3-word sentences. He knew that the system often tried to process veterans before it tried to see them. He took her to his apartment. It was a modest second-floor walk-up in a quiet part of Queens, where the trees still outnumbered the skyscrapers. As they climbed the creaking wooden stairs, a neighbor, Mrs. Higgins, was putting out her recycling. She stopped and stared, her eyes widening as she saw Daniel lead a disheveled soldier into his home. She whispered something under her breath, a look of suspicion and judgment on her face. He just took a stranger home? With a child in the house? What is he thinking? Daniel didn't even look her way. He didn't have room in his mind for the gossip of the street. He had a human soul to ground, and the opinions of the safe world meant nothing to him. When they entered the apartment, the scent of vanilla, cinnamon, and old books greeted them. The walls were covered in Emma's drawings of sunflowers, lighthouses, and smiling dogs. It was a space that was entirely aggressively peaceful. "You can sit here," Emma said, pointing to the worn-out but incredibly comfortable velvet armchair near the window. Clara sat. She didn't take off her jacket. She didn't take off her heavy backpack. She sat perfectly straight, her eyes fixed on a small ceramic lighthouse on the bookshelf. She looked like a soldier awaiting a briefing, her body ready for a battle that was no longer there. Daniel went into the kitchen. He didn't offer 100 options or ask her for her life story. He made tea, simple, warm, and real. He moved with a deliberate slowness, keeping the noise of the kettle to a minimum. He understood that in Clara's current state, every sharp sound was a jagged edge against her nerves. For 30 minutes, no one spoke. Daniel sat on the sofa with Emma, helping her finish a wooden puzzle of a world map. They acted as if it were a perfectly normal Tuesday night. They were providing a non-anxious presence, a concept Daniel had learned from an old Army chaplain who had survived the worst of the Tet Offensive. He was showing Clara that she was safe, not because he told her she was, but because the environment around her refused to be threatened. Clara's breathing began to change. The shallow, rapid gasps were slowly replaced by longer, deeper inhales. The rigid, defensive set of her jaw finally began to soften. She was finally starting to let the city noise stay outside the door. She looked at the drawings on the wall and then at the girl on the floor. Daniel didn't push. He knew that PTSD is like a deep-sea diver coming up too fast. If you pull them into reality too quickly, they get the bends. You have to wait for the internal pressure to equalize. You have to wait for them to decide for themselves that the air here is safe to breathe. After another hour, the little lighthouse on the shelf finally received Clara's full focus. She looked away from it and turned her head toward Daniel. For the first time that night, she wasn't looking through him. She was looking at him. "I didn't know where to go," Clara said. Her voice was raspy and metallic, like iron scraping against stone. It was the first time she had used her vocal cords in 48 hours. Daniel nodded, a small, humble smile touching his lips. "Now you do." The night stretched into the early hours of Wednesday morning. The city outside had finally entered its brief, uneasy slumber. Emma had finally fallen asleep on the sofa, her head resting on a pillow shaped like a star, a half-finished puzzle piece still clutched in her hand. The only sound in the apartment was the rhythmic, comforting ticking of a wall clock and the distant, muffled hum of a street sweeper 3 blocks away. Clara was still in the armchair, but her backpack was now on the floor beside her. She had taken off her heavy combat boots, her wool-socked feet resting on the carpet. She held the tea mug with both hands, the warmth of the ceramic acting as a tactile anchor to the present moment. She was staring at the steam rising from the cup, her face illuminated by the soft amber glow of a floor lamp. Daniel was sitting at the kitchen table, reading a technical manual for a new power substation. He wasn't ignoring her, he was giving her the dignity of space. He understood that for someone like Clara, being watched or analyzed was just another form of being hunted. He was waiting for her to close the gap. "Why did you stop?" Clara asked suddenly, her voice still carry that haunting rasp. Daniel didn't look up immediately. He finished the sentence he was reading, then set the book down with a soft thud. "Because my daughter asked if you were okay, and because I realized you weren't waiting for a train. You were waiting for a cliff." Clara looked at her hands, tracing the scars on her knuckles. "I've been back for 48 hours. My parents, they live in a small town in Ohio. I took a bus to New York because I thought I could disappear here. I thought if there were enough people around, I wouldn't feel so alone. But the subway, the sound of the metal on metal, it sounds like a mortar strike. The flickering lights, they look like flares over the valley. I got stuck. I couldn't find the exit to the real world." Daniel pulled out a chair and sat across from her, but kept a respectful distance, his posture relaxed. The world gets very loud when you've been in the absolute quiet of a base or a desert for too long. Your brain is still looking for the threat, Clara. It's still trying to keep you alive in a place that doesn't exist anymore. It doesn't know the war's over yet. "Is it?" she whispered, her eyes shimmering with the first signs of unshed tears. "Because every time I close my eyes, I'm back in the Humvee. I can smell the burning tires. I can hear the radio chatter screaming for an evac. I keep waiting for the impact. I came home, but I think I left the me that lived here behind. I don't know who this woman in the mirror is." Daniel listened. He didn't offer a corporate platitude or tell her, "Thank you for your service." He didn't tell her it would be okay or that she was a hero. He spoke with the clinical, raw honesty of a man who had seen the damage. "You didn't leave her behind, Clara. She's just buried under the noise. You're like a radio that's stuck between 2 stations, half war, half peace. You just need someone to help you find the frequency of the ground again." Over the next few hours, the story of Clara Hayes spilled out in jagged, painful fragments. She had been a medic with a forward deployment team. She had spent 18 months in a high-intensity combat zone. She spoke of her teammates, names like Jackson and Miller, men she had treated in the back of moving vehicles under heavy fire. She spoke of the night they were ambushed in a narrow valley. She had been the only one in her vehicle to walk away. "When I got my discharge papers, they gave me a brochure on reintegration," Clara said, a bitter, hollow edge to her voice. "They gave me a handshake and a discount at a steakhouse. But how do you reintegrate into a world where people argue about the price of coffee while your friends are still in the sand? Everything here feels plastic. Everything feels too fast. I feel like an alien on my own planet." Daniel nodded slowly. "That's the hardest part. Realizing that the world moved on while you were standing guard. It feels like a betrayal. But that's why I brought you here. Not because I have the answers, but because this house doesn't care about the news or the speed of the city. Here, the only thing that matters is that Emma has her puzzle pieces and the tea is hot. There are no targets here, Clara. Just a floor that stays still. Clara looked at Emma, who was snoring softly. A genuine pained softness crossed the soldier's face. She's a good kid. She has her mother's eyes, doesn't she? She does, Daniel replied, his voice thick with a memory of his own. Sarah died 5 years ago. Emma and I, we had to learn our own kind of survival. We had to learn how to live in a house that felt too empty. We had to learn that silence can either be a prison or a sanctuary. We chose sanctuary. I think you can too. The conversation shifted from the war to the simple mechanics of living. Daniel told her about his job with the power grid, how he liked it because he could see exactly where the connection was broken and fix it with a steady hand. He told her about Emma's dream of being a botanist and her obsession with lighthouses. Clara listened, and as she did, the 1,000-yard stare began to vanish. She was no longer looking at a desert in 2021. She was looking at a kitchen in Queens in the present. She was grounding. She was arriving. "You're a good man, Daniel," Clara said, her voice finally losing its metallic rasp and becoming human. "I'm just someone who knows that the most important view isn't from the top of the tower, it's from the bottom of the tunnel," Daniel said. "You're safe here, Clara. You can stay in that chair as long as you need. You don't have to explain anything to the world tomorrow. The sun will come up whether you're ready or not, but we'll be here when it does." For the first time in 2 days, Clara Hayes closed her eyes and didn't see an explosion. She saw the lighthouse on the shelf. She saw the girl on the sofa. She saw a point of beginning. She realized that Daniel Brooks hadn't saved her. He had simply stood at the exit of the tunnel and held the door open until her eyes adjusted to the light. The silence of the house was no longer heavy. It was the sound of a heart finally daring to beat in the open air. Clara Hayes woke up to the smell of frying eggs and the sound of a child humming a pop song. She was still in the armchair, but someone had covered her with a thick, hand-knitted wool blanket while she slept. She felt a momentary surge of adrenaline, the instinctual reach for a weapon that wasn't there. But then she saw the colorful lighthouses on the wall. She remembered Daniel. She remembered the tea. She stood up, her joints stiff. She walked into the kitchen and saw Emma setting the table with a focused intensity, arranging the forks as if they were precision instruments. "Good morning," Emma chirped, not missing a beat. "Dad says you take your eggs over easy. I like mine with lots of salt and pepper. We're having this special toast today because we have a guest." Daniel was at the stove, his back to them. He looked over his shoulder and offered a calm morning nod. He looked like he had slept even less than she had, but his eyes were bright. "Did you sleep, Clara?" 3 hours, Clara said, a look of genuine surprise on her face. "Without a nightmare. That's a new record since I crossed the border." As they ate breakfast, the atmosphere was light, but the weight of Clara's reality was still very much present. She was a woman with no home, no job, and a mind that was still a battlefield. The uniform she wore felt like a second skin she didn't know how to shed. "I have to call the VA," Clara said, looking at her phone. "I have to tell them I'm in the city. I have to find a place to stay. I can't stay here and be a burden." "You aren't a burden, you're a guest," Daniel said, setting down his coffee. "But I've already contacted an old friend of mine. His name is Marcus. He runs a transition house for veterans in Brooklyn. It's small, it's quiet, and he doesn't ask many questions. He's a former paratrooper. He knows the frequency of the return. I told him you needed a few days of quiet before you hit the paperwork." Clara felt a wave of relief so intense she almost dropped her fork. "Why are you doing all this? You don't even know my last name. I could be anyone." "I know your uniform," Daniel replied. "And I know that when a soldier is stuck in a subway station staring at a wall, they aren't looking for a handout or a medal. They're looking for a bridge. I'm just providing the first few boards." "I've been where you are, Clara. Not in the sand, but in the dark. We all need a lighthouse, eventually." He spent the rest of the morning helping Clara navigate the suffocating bureaucracy of her return. He helped her file her regional paperwork on his laptop and contacted a veteran support group that specialized in medical discharge logistics. He moved through the process with the same methodical precision he used to fix a high-voltage power transformer. Clara watched him work. She saw the way he interacted with the people on the phone, polite, firm, and entirely focused on her needs. She realized that Daniel was a different kind of soldier. He was a guardian of the ground level. He was the person who ensured the foundation was solid before the building went up. As the afternoon approached, it was time for Clara to move to the house in Brooklyn. She stood at the door, her backpack on her shoulders, her boots laced tight. She looked different now. The uniform was the same, but the woman inside it had found her pulse. Her eyes were no longer glass. They were human. Emma walked up to her and handed her a small hand-drawn picture. It was a drawing of a lighthouse standing in the middle of a vibrant green field, with a giant yellow sun above it. "To my friend Clara," it said in neat 9-year-old script, "the light always finds the way home. Don't forget to visit." Clara tucked the drawing into her pocket as if it were a tactical map for the most important mission of her life. She looked at Daniel, her voice trembling. "I don't know how to thank you. I was at the end of the line last night. I didn't think I'd see Wednesday." "The end of one line is just the beginning of another, Clara," Daniel said, placing a grounding hand on her shoulder. "You've done enough for the world. It's time to let the world do something for you. Just keep the lighthouse in mind. And remember, the tea is always hot here." As Daniel drove her toward Brooklyn, Clara looked out the window. The city was still loud. It was still fast. But as she watched the people on the sidewalk, she realized they weren't targets or obstacles anymore. They were just people. She felt a sense of belonging she thought she had lost forever in a valley 5,000 miles away. Daniel had given her more than a place to sleep. He had given her a point of entry back into humanity. He had shown her that her service wasn't a wall between her and the world. It was a bridge that someone else was willing to walk across to find her. The ghosts were still there, but they were no longer the only ones in the room. 1 month later, Daniel was at the same subway station, standing on the same platform with Emma. They were heading to the museum for a school project on urban architecture. The station was just as cold, the fluorescent lights just as flickering, and the trains just as loud. But as Daniel looked toward the corner where he had first seen Clara, he didn't see a ghost. He saw a memory of a victory. His phone buzzed in his pocket. It was a photo from Clara. She wasn't in uniform. She was wearing a simple blue sweater and jeans, standing in a small community garden at the Transition House in Brooklyn. She was holding a watering can, and her eyes were bright and focused on the plants. They were full of the present moment. Underneath the photo was a message. "The lighthouse is still on, Daniel. I'm working at a local clinic now, helping other veterans navigate the noise. I'm finding my way home, one day at a time. Thank you for stopping. Tell Emma the sunflowers we planted are finally blooming." Daniel felt a profound, quiet sense of peace. He hadn't changed the world. He hadn't solved the crisis of veteran care. But he had changed the view for one person. He had proven that the most powerful thing you can do for someone in the dark is to simply stay until the sun comes back out. Emma looked up at him, sensing the change in his energy. "Dad, are we taking this train?" Daniel looked at the doors opening, the rush of people moving in and out. He looked at the faces of the strangers rushing past, wondering how many of them were also looking for an exit. "Yeah, pal, we're taking this one." As the train moved through the tunnel, Daniel watched the lights flashing past the window. He realized that life isn't about the destinations we reach or the titles we hold. It's about the people we refuse to leave behind on the platform. It's about the unexplained decisions that come from the heart and the courage to stop when everyone else is running. The single dad and the soldier were no longer strangers. They were part of the same silent brotherhood of those who choose to stand tall in the light, even when the shadows are long. True healing. It doesn't require a miracle or a government program. It just requires an open door, a warm cup of tea, and a person willing to sit in the silence until the noise goes away. Daniel Brooks was home, and for the first time in 5 years, the frequency was perfect. True courage is not always found on the battlefield. Sometimes it is found in the simple decision to stop for someone who is lost. Never underestimate the power of an unexplained act of kindness. It might be the only bridge someone has back to reality. Silence is not a weakness. It is a sacred space where a broken heart can finally begin to mend. If you believe that one small act of kindness can bring someone back from the dark, subscribe for more stories like this. And tell me in the comments, have you ever stopped to help a stranger when everyone else walked away? What happened?